The most unexpected catalyst for vengeance in Appalachian history, and the most devastating demonstration that attacking a mountain family's means of survival was attacking the family itself, when an entire clan united to slaughter every lawman who had participated in the shooting of a draft horse, whose labor was the only thing standing between 60 people and starvation. This is the true story of the mountain giant. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Letcher County, Kentucky, in the heart of the southeastern coalfields. During the hard years of the 1890s, when the legitimate economy had abandoned the mountain people and when survival depended on resources that outsiders could not comprehend, the mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own understanding of value since before Kentucky was a state, who had never accepted that government agents had the right to destroy what kept them alive. You see, in Letcher County during the years of our story, the draft horse was not merely an animal but was an instrument of survival whose value exceeded anything that money could measure. The steep terrain that characterized the region made farming nearly impossible without animal power. The grades too severe for human labor alone, the soil too rocky for anything except the most determined cultivation. A family without a workhorse was a family condemned to watching their land go fallow, their crops go unplanted, their children go hungry, while neighbors who possessed such animals prospered. The family at the center of our story was the Sizemore clan, a kinship network that had occupied the upper reaches of Rockhouse Creek for 5 generations, that had grown through births and marriages until it numbered more than 60 souls living in a compound of cabins that functioned as a single economic and social unit. The Sizemores were substantial by the standards of mountain families, their holdings including nearly 500 acres of land that had been accumulated through purchases and inheritances over more than a century. That's right, the Sizemore clan in 1895 was led by a patriarch named Elijah Sizemore, a man of 68 years whose authority over his extended family was absolute and whose wisdom had guided them through decades of challenges that would have destroyed less cohesive groups. Elijah had been born in the cabin where he still lived, had married a woman named Martha who had borne him 14 children, had watched those children marry and produce grandchildren until the hollow that bore his family's name contained more Sizemores than any census could accurately count. Elijah was a man whose appearance reflected the life he had lived, tall and broad with a white beard that reached to his chest, hands that remained powerful despite his age, eyes that missed nothing that happened within his domain. His body had been bent by decades of labor, but not broken, his spirit remaining as fierce as it had been in his youth. The family looked to him for guidance on every matter of significance, trusted his judgment with a completeness that reflected both his wisdom and the culture that had produced them. But the true foundation of the Sizemore clan's prosperity was not Elijah's wisdom, but was a horse named Solomon, a Belgian draft horse whose size and strength had made him legendary throughout the region. Solomon stood 18 hands tall at the shoulder, weighed more than 2,000 pounds, possessed a power that could move loads that would have defeated 2 ordinary horses. His color was a deep chestnut that gleamed in sunlight, his mane and tail of flowing white that seemed almost silver, his presence commanding attention from everyone who encountered him. Solomon had been born on the Sizemore property 15 years before the events of our story. the product of a breeding program that Elijah had conducted over decades to produce the perfect workhorse for mountain terrain. His sire had been a Belgian of exceptional size, his dam a mare whose endurance had been proven through years of mountain labor. The combination had produced an animal whose capabilities exceeded anything the region had previously seen. A horse that could pull loads up grades that would have defeated lesser animals, that could work from dawn to dusk without faltering, that could accomplish in hours what would have taken days without his power. The family called him the Mountain Giant, a title that acknowledged both his size and his importance to their survival. Solomon worked every acre of the Sizemore property, pulled the plows that broke the ground, hauled the timber that built the structures, transported the crops that fed the family. His labor was the foundation upon which 60 lives depended, the engine that converted the potential of 500 acres into the sustenance that kept the clan alive. The bond between Solomon and the Sizemore family went beyond the utility that his labor provided. He had been present at the births of children who had grown to adulthood, had carried them on his broad back when they were young, had become a presence in their lives that was more companion than property. The children treated him with affection that might have seemed excessive, applied to an animal, brought him treats, and spent hours brushing his coat. Saw in his patient eyes an intelligence that they believed exceeded what ordinary horses possessed. Elijah himself had a relationship with Solomon that observers found remarkable. The old patriarch visited the horse every morning and every evening, spoke to him in tones that suggested genuine conversation, seemed to derive comfort from the animal's presence that nothing else could provide. Those who knew Elijah well understood that Solomon represented more than an asset to him, represented a connection to the decades of work that had built the family's prosperity, represented the living embodiment of the legacy he had created. The children of the Sizemore clan numbered more than 25 in 1895, ranging from infants to teenagers who were already contributing to the family's operations. Among these children were Samuel, who was 8 years old, and Mary, who was 6, the children of Elijah's youngest son James and his wife Sarah. These children had grown up with Solomon as a constant presence in their lives, had learned to ride on his broad back, had formed attachments to the horse that exceeded what they felt for any other animal on the property. Samuel in particular had developed a bond with Solomon that the family found touching. The boy spent hours with the horse, helped with his feeding and grooming, talked to him about the concerns of childhood as though the animal could understand and respond. Solomon seemed to recognize the boy's devotion, was gentler with Samuel than with others, allowed liberties that he would not have permitted from adults. The relationship was one of the small beauties that life in the hollow provided, a connection between a child and an animal that enriched both their existences. The events that would transform the Sizemore clan from farmers to executioners began in the autumn of 1895, when a new sheriff took office in Letcher County, with a determination to assert authority that his predecessors had never attempted. This sheriff was named Vernon Crawford, a man whose political ambitions required him to demonstrate control over a region that had long resisted outside interference, whose approach to law enforcement reflected a belief that the mountain people needed to be taught respect for government authority. Crawford brought with him a force of 22 deputies whose selection had been based on their willingness to employ whatever methods their leader directed. These were not career peace officers, but were men hired specifically for the aggressive campaign that Crawford intended to conduct, men whose previous experience included work as strikebreakers and hired guns, men who understood that their assignment involved intimidation that ordinary enforcement would not require. The pretext for the raid that would destroy everything was a report that the Sizemores were operating a moonshine still, an accusation that was partially accurate, but that had never before attracted serious enforcement attention. The Sizemores did produce whiskey for their own consumption and for limited sale to neighbors, a practice that was common throughout the region and that previous sheriffs had chosen to ignore. Crawford saw in this violation an opportunity to demonstrate his authority, to send a message that his administration would be different from those that had come before. The raid came on the morning of the 15th of November, 1895, in the pre-dawn hours when Crawford believed the hollow would be least defended. His 22 deputies approached through routes that informants had identified, surrounded the compound before any alarm could be raised, prepared to search every structure for evidence of the still that their intelligence had promised. The approach demonstrated both Crawford's planning and his determination to make an example of one of the county's most prominent families. The violence that followed was not part of any legitimate law enforcement purpose, but was a demonstration of power that reflected Crawford's contempt for the people he was supposed to serve. The deputies did not merely search the property, but ransacked it, destroyed furniture and possessions that had nothing to do with moonshine, inflicted damage that went far beyond what any search might require. They found the small still that the family used, seized it along with the whiskey it had produced, but the seizure was almost incidental to the broader destruction they conducted. The confrontation that would change everything occurred when the deputies approached the barn where Solomon was stabled. Elijah had emerged from his cabin at the sound of the disturbance, had made his way toward the deputies with the intention of confronting them about the damage they were inflicting. The old patriarch's approach was interpreted, or claimed to be interpreted, as threatening by deputies whose instructions had emphasized the potential for resistance. What happened next would be disputed for generations, the deputies claiming that Solomon had broken free and charged them, that the shooting was self-defense against an animal whose size made him dangerous. The family's account was different. The deputies had entered the barn with the intention of taking Solomon, had been frustrated when Elijah refused to surrender the horse, had shot the animal in retaliation for the old man's defiance. The shots came in rapid succession, multiple deputies firing at Solomon with the rifles they had brought for the raid. The first shot struck the horse in the shoulder, the impact staggering him but not bringing him down, his massive body absorbing damage that would have felled a lesser animal. The second shot struck his flank, and the third his neck, the blood beginning to flow from wounds that his great heart was pumping out with every beat. Solomon screamed as the bullet struck him, a sound that family members would remember for the rest of their lives. A cry of pain and confusion from an animal that had never experienced violence and could not understand why it was being inflicted. The sound was unlike anything a horse normally produced, a vocalization that seemed almost human in its expression of betrayal and anguish. Children who heard it would wake from nightmares for years, the sound echoing through their sleep, the memory of Solomon's final voice impossible to escape. The deputies continued firing even after the horse had fallen, putting additional bullets into a body that was already dying, demonstrating a cruelty that exceeded any possible necessity. Some of them were laughing, finding humor in the spectacle of the massive animal struggling against death, mocking the Sizemores' attachment to a beast that was, in their view, merely property to be disposed of. Solomon fell against the wall of his stall, his massive body shuddering with each impact, his legs giving way as the life drained out of him. The stall that had been his home for 15 years became soaked with blood that pooled beneath him, the straw that should have been his bedding becoming saturated with the evidence of his murder. His breathing became labored, each breath producing a sound that those who heard it would never forget, the wheeze of lungs that were filling with blood. Elijah reached the barn in time to see the final moments, pushed through the deputies who tried to hold him back, knelt beside the horse that had been the foundation of his family's survival for 15 years. The old patriarch's knees gave way in the blood-soaked straw, his hands finding Solomon's great head and cradling it as he might have cradled a dying child. Solomon's eyes found the old man's face, seemed to recognize him even as the light was fading from them, conveyed something that those who witnessed it could only describe as goodbye. The horse's breathing slowed, each breath more shallow than the last, the great chest rising and falling with decreasing strength. Elijah spoke to him, words that no one else could hear. A private communication between partners who had worked together for 15 years and who were now being separated forever. The horse died with his head in Elijah's lap, the patriarch's tears fallen onto the chestnut coat that would never gleam in sunlight again. The moment of death was visible to everyone watching, the great body going still, the eyes losing their focus, the breathing stopping entirely. The mountain giant was gone, and with him went something essential in the old man who had raised him and worked beside him and loved him. The deputies laughed as they departed, some of them pausing to make comments about the old man weeping over a horse, others kicking at Solomon's body as they passed. Crawford himself stood watching, his expression suggesting satisfaction at the pain his men had inflicted, his authority demonstrated through the destruction of something that the Sycamores valued. The raid had found a small still and a few gallons of whiskey, evidence that would hardly justify the destruction that had accompanied its seizure. Elijah remained with Solomon's body for hours after the deputies departed, speaking to the horse as though he could still hear, apologizing for failing to protect him, promising that what had been done would not go unanswered. The family gathered around him, their grief for the horse genuine, but their concern for the patriarch even greater. Elijah was 68 years old, had put more of himself into Solomon than anyone fully understood, seemed to have lost something essential when the horse died. The patriarch collapsed 3 days after the raid, his heart given out in the field where he had worked beside Solomon for 15 years. He had spent those 3 days in a state that his family found almost more disturbing than death itself, sitting beside Solomon's grave for hours at a time, speaking to the buried horse as though he could still hear, refusing food that he said he had no appetite for, seeming to fade before their eyes into something less than the man he had been. The collapse came without warning, Elijah falling in the field where he had gone to work, despite his family's pleas that he rest. His sons found him lying in the dirt, his face turned toward the spot where Solomon was buried, his expression peaceful in a way that it had not been since the shooting. The physician who examined him attributed the death to cardiac failure, but the family knew the true cause. Elijah had died of grief for the horse that had been murdered before his eyes, had been unable to survive the loss of the animal that had been his partner and his pride. The funeral was attended by the entire clan, 60 people standing around a grave that was dug beside Solomon's. The patriarch and his horse reunited in death as they had been connected in life. The preacher who delivered the eulogy spoke of Elijah's faith and his family, but everyone present understood that the service was incomplete without acknowledging the horse whose death had precipitated the patriarchs. A prayer was offered for Solomon, too, an unusual gesture that reflected the unusual bond that had existed between man and animal. The patriarch was buried beside the grave that the family had dug for Solomon. The two of them reunited in death as they had been connected in life. But the loss of Solomon and Elijah was only the beginning of the disaster that the raid had imposed. Without the horse, the family had no way to work their 500 acres, no way to plow the fields that needed plowing, no way to haul the timber that their building required. The work that Solomon had done could not be replaced by human labor alone, the tasks too heavy and the terrain too steep for anything except animal power. The family tried everything they could imagine to compensate for Solomon's loss. They borrowed horses from neighbors, but the animals were smaller and weaker, unable to manage the grades that Solomon had climbed without difficulty. They attempted to work the land with human labor alone, but the tasks that Solomon had accomplished in hours took days when performed by men, and even then the results were inadequate. They tried to purchase a replacement draft horse, but animals of Solomon's capability were rare and expensive, far beyond what the family could afford. A draft horse of comparable capability would have cost more than the family could afford, would have required months to locate even if money had been available. The Sizemores had breeding records that showed Solomon's bloodline, had contacts throughout the region who might have known of similar animals, but the search produced nothing. There were no horses like Solomon, no animals whose power could match what he had provided, no way to replace what had been destroyed in seconds by deputies whose contempt had exceeded any enforcement purpose. The winter of 1895–96 was harsh even by Kentucky standards, and the Sizemore family faced it without the patriarch who had guided them and without the horse whose labor had sustained them. The crops that had been planted but not yet harvested rotted in fields that could not be worked. The firewood that should have been cut and hauled remained in forests that human labor could not efficiently access. The supplies that should have been laid in for winter were insufficient because the transportation that Solomon had provided was no longer available. The children suffered first, as children always did when resources became scarce. Samuel, the 8-year-old who had loved Solomon most, developed the wasting illness that inadequate nutrition produced. His small body unable to maintain itself against the deprivation that the winter imposed. The boy who had spent hours brushing Solomon's coat, who had ridden on the great horse's back, who had talked to the animal about his dreams and fears, now lay in a bed from which he could not rise. He called for the horse in his delirium, asked when Solomon was coming back, did not understand that the animal he loved was buried in the field beside the grandfather he had also lost. His mother sat with him through the long nights, tried to explain that Solomon was gone, found that the truth was too painful to tell a dying child and that lies were too painful to maintain. She let him believe what he needed to believe, let him imagine that Solomon would come for him, let him die with hope that reality could not provide. The progression of Samuel's illness followed a pattern that the family recognized from other winters when food had been scarce. First came the weakness, the inability to perform tasks that had once been routine. Then came the swelling, the paradoxical bloating that starvation produced, as the body lost its ability to manage fluids. Then came the sores that would not heal, the hair that fell out in patches, the teeth that loosened in gums that could no longer hold them. Finally came the delirium, the mind retreating from a body that was consuming itself. Samuel died on the 15th of February, 1896, exactly 3 months after the raid that had killed Solomon and precipitated his grandfather's death. His final words were a request to see the horse one more time, a plea that his mother could not fulfill, a last expression of the love that had connected a boy and an animal in ways that death had severed but that memory would preserve. His father James dug the grave himself, the frozen ground yielding only to fury that grief could not contain. Mary followed 6 weeks later, the 6-year-old succumbing to the same progression of illness that had taken her brother. She had watched Samuel die, had understood in her child's way that something terrible was happening to their family, had asked questions about death that no 6-year-old should have needed to ask. Why did Samuel have to go away? Was he with Solomon now? Would she have to go away too? Her parents could not answer her questions honestly, could not tell her that she would likely follow her brother, could not explain that the deputies who had killed a horse had condemned her to the same fate. They told her stories instead, invented a heaven where Solomon and Samuel waited for them, created a fantasy that made the truth bearable. She believed them because children believe their parents died, believing that she was going somewhere beautiful. Her death came quietly, almost peacefully, her weakened body simply surrendering to conditions it could no longer fight. The deaths of Elijah and the two children, all traceable to the shooting of Solomon, completed the transformation that had begun when the first shots struck the horse. The Sizemore clan was no longer merely grieving, but was united in a determination for vengeance that superseded every other consideration. 3 human deaths and 1 horse, 4 losses that demanded response according to a code that the mountain people had followed for generations. The planning began immediately after Mary's burial, the surviving members of the clan gathering to discuss how the vengeance would be achieved. The discussion was led by Elijah's sons, 5 men whose grief for their father was compounded by fury at what had been done to their family, whose capabilities for violence had been demonstrated in conflicts that had marked the region's history. The eldest son, also named Elijah, but called Big Zeke to distinguish him from his father, was 45 years old. A man whose size matched his father's and whose authority over his brothers was accepted without question. The second son, Thomas, was 42, a man of few words whose skill with weapons was known throughout the county. The third son, James, was 39, the father of the 2 children who had starved, whose grief gave him a personal stake in the vengeance that exceeded even what the others felt. The fourth son, William, was 36, possessed of an intelligence that made him the natural planner for whatever operation the family undertook. The fifth son, Daniel, was 33, the youngest but perhaps the most fierce, whose temperament made him ideal for the work that lay ahead. The method they chose reflected both the crime that had been committed against them and the resources that their family possessed. The deputies had shot Solomon like an animal, had laughed while the horse died, had treated the family's most valuable possession as though it were worthless. The Sizemores would hunt the deputies as they might hunt animals, would track them and kill them with the same indifference that had characterized Solomon's death, would demonstrate that treating the family's property with contempt had consequences that no badge could prevent. The campaign would require patience and coordination that only a large family could provide. The 22 deputies who had participated in the raid had scattered after completing their work, some remaining in the county for continued duties, others returning to homes in other regions. The Sizemores would need to locate each one, would need to reach them wherever they had gone, would need to execute the killings in ways that could not be traced back to the family until the work was complete. The intelligence network that generations of mountain living had created was redirected toward the new purpose. Relatives who had married into other families became sources of information about deputy movements. Travelers who passed through Sizemore territory were questioned about anything they might have seen or heard. Business contacts in towns throughout the region provided updates about deputies who had settled in their areas. Within weeks, the family had located all 22 deputies, had documented their routines and their vulnerabilities, had begun planning the operations that would claim their lives. The first killing came 8 weeks after Mary's burial, on the night of the 15th of May, 1896. The target was a man named Dale Tackett, one of the deputies who had fired shots into Solomon, whose laughing face had been noted by family members as he departed the property. Tackett had remained in Letcher County for continued deputy work, was living in a boarding house in Whitesburg, was accessible in ways that deputies who had returned to other regions were not. The killing was a hunting operation, conducted with the same patience and skill that the Sizemores had always applied to tracking game. Big Zeke led a team of 3 brothers who had spent days observing Tackett's routines, identifying the moments when he was vulnerable, preparing the ambush that would end his life. They caught him on a road between Whitesburg and a neighboring community, shot him from cover as they might have shot a deer, watched as he fell from his horse and lay still on the road where he died. The body was left where it fell. No attempt made at concealment. The message clear to anyone who understood the history. A deputy who had participated in the Sizemore raid was dead, killed in a manner that suggested hunting. His death. The first payment on a debt that had 21 more installments. The connection was obvious, but proving it was another matter entirely. The investigation that followed focused immediately on the Sizemore clan, the motive obvious to anyone who knew the history. But proving the connection required evidence that the family had been careful not to leave. They had alibis provided by family members whose testimony could not be broken, had disposed of evidence with a thoroughness that left nothing for investigators to find, had constructed a wall of silence that no interrogation could penetrate. The second killing came 3 weeks later, another deputy shot in circumstances that echoed Tackett's death. This victim, Robert Lawson, had been one of those who had kicked Solomon's body as he departed, whose contempt for the family and their horse had been particularly noted. His body was found on a road similar to the one where Tackett had died, the wounds consistent with rifle fire from a concealed position, the method identical to what hunters used for game. That's right. The Sizemore clan continued their campaign through the summer of 1896, claiming victims with a regularity that reflected their patience and their coordination. The third killing came in June, the fourth in July, each following the same pattern. A deputy tracked, his routines documented. His death accomplished through hunting methods that the family had practiced for generations. The bodies were always left where they fell, the message repeated with each killing. This is what happens to those who attack the Sizemore family. The fifth and sixth killings came within a single week, the pace accelerating as the family grew more confident in their methods. These victims were deputies who had returned to other counties after the raid, were tracked and reached through the extended network that the Sizemores had developed, were killed with the same hunting precision that had characterized the earlier deaths. The message was clear. Distance provided no protection. Relocation offered no safety. Every deputy who had participated in the raid would eventually be found. The seventh killing demonstrated the family's adaptability. The victim was Crawford's chief deputy, a man named William Howard, whose caution had made a hunting-style ambush impossible. Howard traveled in groups, varied his routes, took precautions that reflected his awareness that the Sizemores were hunting his colleagues. The family adjusted their approach, waited for an opportunity that conventional hunting could not provide. Struck when Howard believed himself safe within the protection of numbers. The attack came at night, multiple Sizemore men surrounding the group that Howard was traveling with, killing the deputy in a coordinated assault that also claimed 2 of his companions. The additional deaths were not part of the original plan, but were accepted as necessary consequences of reaching a target who had made himself difficult to reach. The message was adjusted. Those who protected the deputies were themselves targets, their safety dependent on their willingness to abandon men the Sizemores had marked for death. The 8th, 9th, and 10th killings came in rapid succession, the family's campaign reaching a pace that the sheriff's department could not match. Deputies who had believed themselves safe began to understand that they were being hunted systematically, began to flee to other states and other regions, began to request protection that local government was increasingly unable to provide. Sheriff Crawford found himself losing deputies faster than he could replace them, the campaign against the Sizemores becoming a disaster that no official response could address. He appealed to the state for assistance, requested resources that might allow him to catch the killers who were decimating his force. The assistance that arrived was insufficient, the resources inadequate against a family that operated with an efficiency that reflected generations of experience in terrain that outsiders could not effectively navigate. The 11th through 15th killings occurred between September and December of 1896, each following the established hunting pattern, each adding to the toll that was destroying the sheriff's department from within. The deputies who remained alive grew increasingly paranoid, saw threats in every shadow, trusted no one whose loyalty had not been proven through years of association. Their fear was justified. The Sizemores could reach anyone they targeted, their hunting skills making conventional protection meaningless. The 16th killing came in January of 1897, the anniversary of the winter that had killed Samuel and Mary, the timing deliberate in ways that everyone who knew the story understood. The victim was a deputy who had been present when Solomon was shot, whose participation in the raid had contributed to the cascade of deaths that followed. His body was left at a crossroads near the Sizemore property, positioned as though it were game that hunters had taken and displayed. The 17th and 18th killings came in February and March, each marking an anniversary that the family would not let pass without response. Samuel's death was commemorated with a killing, Mary's death with another, the pattern making clear that the family's grief was being transmuted into vengeance with a precision that matched date to victim. The 19th and 20th killings cleared the field of everyone except Crawford himself and his last remaining deputy. The campaign had taken nearly 2 years, had claimed 20 lives, had demonstrated capabilities that the law enforcement community found almost impossible to comprehend. A mountain family, operating without formal organization or external support, had systematically eliminated an entire sheriff's department through hunting methods that no protection could defeat. The final deputy died in April of 1897, killed in circumstances that echoed all the previous deaths. His body left on a road where travelers would find it and where its condition would send the familiar message. And then there was only Crawford, the sheriff who had ordered the raid, who had watched while his deputies shot Solomon, who had allowed his men to laugh at a dying horse and a weeping patriarch. Crawford knew he was the final target, understood that the Sizemores would never stop until he had joined the 21 men who had preceded him. He fortified his home, surrounded himself with guards brought from outside the county, took every precaution that his remaining resources could provide. The precautions were meaningless against hunters who had been tracking game in these mountains for 5 generations. The killing of Vernon Crawford was the culmination of everything the Sizemores had learned over 2 years of systematic hunting. They approached his fortified home as they might have approached a den where dangerous game had taken refuge, studied its defenses for weeks before attempting penetration, identified weaknesses that Crawford's imported guards had not anticipated. The attack came on the night of the 15th of May, 1897, exactly 2 years after the raid that had killed Solomon. The guards died first, picked off from positions they could not detect, their bodies falling silently in the darkness. Big Zeke led the team that entered Crawford's home, moved through rooms where the sheriff believed himself safe, reached the bedroom where Crawford slept with a pistol beside his bed that he would never have the chance to reach. Crawford woke to find 5 Sizemore brothers standing around his bed, their rifles pointed at a man whose power had meant nothing against their patience and their skill. Big Zeke spoke for the family. his voice soft but carrying the weight of everything that had been lost. "You killed our horse," he said. "You laughed while Solomon died. Our father died of grief 3 days later. 2 children starved because we couldn't work our land without Solomon's power. 21 of your men have died because of what you did. Now it's your turn." Crawford tried to speak, tried to explain or excuse or threaten, but the Sizemores were not interested in anything he had to say. They had not hunted 21 men over 2 years to engage in conversation with the 22nd. They killed him as they had killed the others, efficiently and without ceremony. Left his body in his bed where his household would find it in the morning. The investigation that followed was the most extensive in the history of law enforcement in eastern Kentucky. 22 deputies and a sheriff had been killed over a period of 2 years, all connected to a single raid, all killed through hunting methods that reflected the skills of people who had lived in these mountains for generations. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward the Sizemore clan, whose motive was obvious, and whose capabilities matched what the killings had required. But no prosecution was ever successful. The family maintained the silence that mountain culture demanded, provided alibis that could not be broken, presented a united front that no investigator could penetrate. Witnesses who might have testified developed memory problems that no pressure could resolve. Jurors who might have convicted showed sympathy that reflected community attitudes about the relative guilt of the family and the men who had attacked them. The state eventually abandoned its efforts to prosecute, concluded that conviction was impossible given the community's refusal to cooperate, withdrew from Letcher County with a tacit acknowledgement that the Sizemores had won. The family eventually acquired a new draft horse, rebuilt their capacity to work the land that had sustained them, continued the life that the raid had interrupted but that their vengeance had made possible to resume. The Sizemore clan continued in the hollow that bore their name for another 4 generations, the family eventually dispersing as the 20th century transformed the region and eliminated the isolation that had allowed them to maintain their way of life. Some descendants moved to other states, some remained in Kentucky, all carried memories of what their ancestors had done and why. The story was passed down through generations, becoming part of the family's identity in ways that pride and sorrow mingled. The graves where Elijah and Solomon rest side by side are still maintained by descendants who return to the hollow for annual gatherings that commemorate what happened and what it cost. The patriarch's stone bears an inscription that acknowledges his bond with the horse. He worked beside his partner. Solomon's stone is unusual, a memorial to an animal that most cultures would not have honored with such recognition. The mountain giant. He carried us all. The children's graves nearby bear simpler inscriptions. Samuel and Mary. Taken too soon. The site where Solomon was shot has been preserved, the barn rebuilt, but the stall where he died marked with a plaque the descendants installed a century after the events. Some visitors claim to feel something unusual at the site, a heaviness that lingers in places where beloved creatures have died violently, though such claims may reflect expectation as much as genuine experience. The legal aftermath of the case was significant despite the failure to prosecute. The deaths of 22 law enforcement officers prompted a complete reevaluation of enforcement tactics in Appalachia, a recognition that the aggressive methods that Crawford had employed had provoked consequences that no enforcement purpose could justify. Future sheriffs approached the mountain communities with a caution that reflected the knowledge that families would protect their own and would avenge wrongs that the legal system would not address. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the specific reforms it prompted. The story of the mountain giant became a cautionary tale about the value that mountain families placed on their animals. a reminder that a workhorse might represent survival itself, and that killing such an animal was tantamount to killing the family that depended on it. Law enforcement officers who operated in Appalachia in the decades that followed were aware of the story, understood its implications, approached their work with an understanding that the destruction of property could have consequences as severe as the destruction of human life. The songs that emerged from the mountain giant story were unlike any others in the Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies and lyrics that captured the unusual nature of the inciting incident and the devastating consequences that followed. The most popular ballad told the story from beginning to end, from Solomon's birth and his bond with the family, through the raid and the shooting, to the campaign that had answered the horse's death with 22 human deaths. The first verse described Solomon as he had been in life, his size and his strength, his partnership with Elijah, his role as the foundation upon which 60 lives depended. The melody was warm and powerful, suggesting an animal whose capabilities exceeded what ordinary horses could provide, whose loss would be catastrophic for those who depended on him. The second verse described the bond between Solomon and the family, the children who had grown up with him, young Samuel's particular devotion, the relationship between horse and boy that enriched both their existences. The melody became tender here, the notes carrying affection that transcended the boundary between human and animal. The third verse described the raid, the deputies entering the barn, the shots that struck Solomon while Elijah watched helplessly, the horse dying with his head in the patriarch's lap. This verse was difficult to hear, its melody dropping into registers that suggested grief too deep for human voices to carry. The fourth verse described the deaths that followed, Elijah collapsing from grief, Samuel and Mary starving because the family could not work their land without Solomon's power. This verse was the hardest of all, its melody barely audible, its lyrics creating a chain of consequences that connected a horse's death to a grandfather's and 2 children's. The fifth verse described the planning, the family's decision to hunt the deputies as they might hunt game, the commitment to reach every man regardless of where he had fled. The melody shifted here, becoming darker and more purposeful, suggesting hunters preparing for a campaign that would last as long as necessary. The sixth verse described the campaign itself, the 22 deputies falling one by one, the hunting methods that made each kill a demonstration of skills that generations had refined. The melody had a relentless quality here, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat, the notes suggesting inevitability that no protection could prevent. The seventh verse described Crawford's death, the final victim falling in his own bed, the circle completing in the darkness where his power meant nothing against the hunters who had come for him. The melody reached its darkest point here, the notes suggesting satisfaction that was indistinguishable from justice. The final verse described the aftermath, the family's acquisition of a new horse, the resumption of life that the raid had interrupted, the generations that followed carrying memories of what their ancestors had done. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, though a peace that carried the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that had been done in response. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with a complexity that reflected the story's unusual nature. There was something almost absurd about 22 men dying because of a horse, and yet there was also recognition that the horse had represented survival itself, that his death had led directly to 3 human deaths, that the family's response was proportionate to what they had actually lost rather than to what outsiders might have perceived. Another song focused specifically on Solomon himself, describing his breeding and his capabilities, his bond with Elijah and with young Samuel, his death and the grief that followed. This song was almost a memorial, its verses honoring an animal whose value had exceeded what most people could comprehend, whose loss had justified vengeance that most would have reserved for human deaths. A third song examined the relationship between Solomon and Samuel, the boy whose love for the horse had been so complete, whose death from starvation could be traced to the loss of the animal that had made the family's farming possible. This song was the most painful of the tradition, its melody connecting a child and an animal in ways that made both deaths seem equally tragic. A fourth song addressed the question that outsiders always asked: how could a horse's death justify 22 human deaths? The song examined the question without answering it directly, explored the ways that mountain families valued their animals differently than outsiders might, suggested that Solomon had been not merely property but family in ways that the law could not recognize, but that the Sizemores had proven through their response. A fifth song celebrated the hunting skills that the campaign had demonstrated, the ability to track and kill 22 men over 2 years using methods developed for game, the translation of agricultural capabilities into instruments of death. This song had an almost admiring quality, its melody suggesting respect for competence that exceeded what most families could have achieved. The historians who have studied the mountain giant case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of the value that mountain families placed on their work animals, arguing that the killing of Solomon had been understood as an attack on the family's survival rather than merely as destruction of property. The cascade of deaths that followed the horse's killing, from Elijah's grief-induced collapse to the children's starvation, demonstrated that the connection between animal and family survival was not metaphorical but literal. Others have focused on the hunting methods that the Sizemores employed, examining how skills developed for taking game were adapted for taking human lives. The efficiency of the campaign, 22 kills over 2 years with no successful prosecutions, demonstrated capabilities that formal military organizations might have envied. The family had conducted a sustained campaign of targeted killing that achieved its objectives while avoiding any legal consequences. The agricultural analysis has examined the role of draft horses in mountain farming, noting that Solomon's capabilities had been essential for working terrain that human labor alone could not manage. The loss of such an animal was not merely an economic setback, but was potentially fatal for families whose survival depended on the work that only animal power could accomplish. The starvation of Samuel and Mary was not an unexpected consequence, but was a predictable result of losing the horse that made the family's farming possible. The psychological analysis has examined the bonds between humans and animals that the story reveals, noting that Elijah's death from grief suggested a connection to Solomon that exceeded what most people would form with an animal. The relationship had apparently been deep enough that its severance was literally fatal. The patriarch unable to survive the loss of a partner he had worked beside for 15 years. The sociological analysis has examined the community's protection of the Sizemores, noting that the wall of silence extended far beyond the family itself to include neighbors and associates who understood what had been lost and what had been done in response. The community apparently accepted that the killing of a workhorse, when that killing led to human deaths, justified human vengeance that the legal system would never have provided. The legal analysis has examined the failure to prosecute, noting that the case demonstrated the limits of law enforcement authority in communities that were determined to resist it. The evidence against the Sizemores was overwhelming, the pattern of killings undeniable, the connection to the raid impossible to miss. But conviction required community cooperation that was not forthcoming, witnesses willing to testify, jurors willing to convict, all of which the community withheld. You see, What the Sizemore clan did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. They killed 22 men over 2 years, used hunting methods that reduced their victims to the status of game, conducted a campaign that the law could never sanction regardless of the provocation. The fact that Solomon's death had led to Elijah's death and to Samuel and Mary's starvation does not eliminate the fact that the family took 22 human lives in response. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Their patriarch had died of grief for a horse the deputies had shot while laughing. Their children had starved because the family could not work their land without the horse's power. Their entire means of survival had been destroyed by men who faced no consequences from a legal system that protected them. The system that should have limited enforcement to proportionate measures had instead allowed destruction that was itself deadly, had made clear through its protection of the deputies that mountain lives and mountain animals meant nothing when weighed against official authority. The question of whether killing a horse could justify killing 22 men is one that the community answered through its refusal to cooperate with prosecution. The community understood that Solomon had not been merely an animal, but had been the foundation of 60 lives, that his death had led directly to 3 human deaths, that the family's response was proportionate to what they had actually lost rather than to what the law might have recognized. Their verdict, expressed through silence rather than words, was that the Sizemores had done what justice required. The descendants of the Sizemore clan still gather annually in the hollow where their ancestors lived, still maintain the graves where Solomon and Elijah and the children rest, still carry memories that have been passed down through generations. Some descendants are proud of what their ancestors did, viewing the campaign as evidence of family strength and family loyalty. Others are troubled by the scale of the response, questioning whether any horse, however valuable, could justify 22 deaths. Most hold both feelings simultaneously, the pride and the doubt existing side by side, as they do in any honest assessment of the story. The story of the mountain giant endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of bonds between humans and animals that exceeded what most people can comprehend, of a horse whose death led to human deaths and whose memory was honored through human vengeance. It is the story of skills applied to unexpected purposes, of hunting methods transformed into instruments of systematic killing, of capabilities developed for taking game turned against human targets. It is the story of a community that understood what outsiders could not, that accepted violence for an animal because they knew that animal had been essential to human survival. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves of Solomon and Elijah, to read the inscriptions that promise they worked together, to see the smaller stones that mark where Samuel and Mary rest? Would you walk through the hollow where the Sizemores lived? Would you seek out the barn where Solomon died? Would you try to understand how a horse's death could justify 22 human deaths? The journey to Letcher County is easier now than it was in 1895. The roads paved and the connections to the outside world more numerous than they were when the Sizemore clan hunted 22 lawmen who had shot their prized workhorse. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of patriarchs and horses and children rest in those mountains, and the stories of those who avenged them echo still through hollows that have witnessed both crimes and their answers. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. The story of the mountain giant has been told and retold through generations, passed from parent to child. sung in ballads that still bring shivers to those who hear them. It is a story about what happens when lawmen kill a family's means of survival and laugh while it dies. When a patriarch follows his horse into death, when children starve because the power that worked the land has been destroyed. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the value of animals and the value of human lives, about what justifies vengeance and what exceeds it, about what any family might do if deputies shot their horse and left them to starve. And that, my friend, is the true story of the mountain giant of the Sizemore clan who slaughtered 22 lawmen who had shot their prized workhorse, who answered 1 animal death and 3 human deaths with 22 deaths of their own, who conducted a campaign of hunting vengeance that lasted 2 years and ended with the sheriff dying in his own bed. A story of a horse named Solomon and the family who loved him, of hunting skills applied to human prey, of a patriarch and 2 children whose deaths demanded response that an entire clan provided. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.